I'm Lee Cullum. I'm a member of the InterAmerican Dialogue, and with me is Enrique Garcia, Enrique Garcia.
Today, CAF has changed a little bit the name, and today we call ourselves CAF, Development Bank of Latin America. And you might ask, well, what's OF? OF means a sense of property, because we are the only multilateral regional bank in the world which in essence is owned by emerging countries. And that's in essence, and today we are an institution that provides financial services, loans, equity, technical cooperation in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we are more or less about 1/3 of all the lending in Latin America coming from multilateral.
Hey, this was about 1979 when you arrived there. Those were rough days. I mean, Perón returned, Perón, forgive me, Ross
Yes.
Perón. Perón returned in, 1973 or 74,
Yes.
was president for a year. Then Isabelita, his wife and vice president, took over. Then she was dispatched, sent into exile. And those were very rough days, were they not?
Well, that's precisely what you're saying, you know, that if you take the InterAmerican Dialogue, which precisely is having 30 years of anniversary now, you see when it was founded, the scenario was quite different from now. Let's see what was happening at that time. At that time, you were precisely moving out from dictatorships to democracy. That's one thing. One by one, countries moved out. Secondly, in the early 80s, that was the rough time for Latin America. We had the Mexican debt crisis, which exploded in all the region. You had hyperinflation in many countries. So, as Enrique Iglesias called the 80s, is the lost decade of Latin America. And what has happened is that since then, as I said before, we learned the lessons and we had put the house in order. And today, we can say we are part of the solution, not of the problem. Nonetheless, we at CAF and myself, we are very cautious because I think Latin America has to look at the future and to see what the gaps are. And for the InterAmerican Dialogue, it's very important to understand that. Notwithstanding the fact that Latin America has done very well in macroeconomic terms, I don't think we can be complacent and satisfied, because still there are very important gaps. Gaps that I think we have good growth. Yes, average of 4.55, okay, it sounds
pretty
okay.
good.
But if you want to converge with industrialized countries and simultaneously to have a sustainable solution to the main issue in Latin America still, which is inequality, you have to grow at least at 6.5% on a regular basis. It's easy to say, but how you reach that? That implies that we have to look at the future with a long-term strategy. And that strategy implies, first of all, that productive transformation. You know, it's good to have the commodities generating all this surplus, but it can be a curse because you are not developing what is important in a society, which is more innovation and technology, more employment, and that is what we call sustained inclusive growth. And that's what we are trying to put together. So for the dialogue, it's very important to understand that. And also, if you look and compare, going back to the early 80s, late 70s, the U.S.-Latin America relationship was different, because at that time, first of all, you still had the Soviet Union, you didn't have China as it is now, and you had the crisis in Latin America. So Latin America had a very high dependence on the United States. And I think the relationship was very, very strong. Several administrations in the U.S. tried to put together with the Latin American governments very important programs of free trade, of cooperation. What we see now is a different environment. You have a different structure of power. China is very strong, Asia is very strong, the US has had difficulties, Europe is having very serious problems. And I see, quite frankly, that the US-Latin American relationship is not as strong and good as it was before. So what's the main challenge, in my opinion? My main challenge is that U.S. and Latin America reconstruct a closer relationship, not only in terms of trade, but in terms of investment, in terms of cultural exchange, in terms of political understanding. And that, of course, is a role that this dialogue, in which you and I belong, and I'm a member of the board, can play a very important role, because it's a place of not only of thinkers, it's also a place where practitioners of both Latin America, the Caribbean, the United States, and Canada join together to discuss issues, and people who can have positive influence in decision making in our countries.
You're saying it's an organization not only of thinkers but of doers.
Of doers, correct, and with a high commitment. And I think we should be very proud of what the dialogue has done.
You mentioned gaps. There are a couple of gaps that might also be mentioned. One is Venezuela, where you have your headquarters in Caracas. The other is Cuba. Gaps simply because they seem to have fallen out of the democratic idea, and if they ever fell into it. And I'm just wondering what you foresee on those two fronts.
No, I tell one thing. First of all, if it's again very interesting to compare. If you go back 30 years and you compare Cuba today, I think Cuba is moving in a direction to become a part of the dialogue with the rest, and you can see in actions, concrete actions. I think that in this sense, it's very important that especially the U.S. policy is more open, more realistic in this endeavor. If you go to Latin America today, for instance, I have been in the summits, all the summits of Latin American Caribbean. Most of the presidents, I would say most of the countries are pushing for having a stronger dialogue and between the parties, and that implies essentially how do you improve the quality of the dialogue between the United States and Cuba. I think, and I'm optimistic. I think if we go back and I compare, notwithstanding the difficulties that still exist. Now, the case of Venezuela, I think when there will be elections very soon, and well, we'll see what the outcome of the elections are. And, you know, it's a society that is in evolution. Maybe some people might like it, they dislike it, but there's one reality that the government that is there, he got there winning elections. Now, the question is whether you like it or not, but I think the trend is to try to establish positive dialogue. That's the main thing. When you are antagonist in the positions, then you know, you don't get good results.
And you're going to say the same thing, I suppose, about post-Chavez Venezuela.
Well, I don't know. I think
whenever that is.
Yeah, but one thing that you have to be realistic about is that Venezuela might have had some criticism of many aspects, but one issue that is real is that social inclusion has occurred, and that's part of the thing. But now what's important is to strengthen the institutional framework for democracy, and I hope that trend will continue that way.
Looking ahead to the next 30 years, you mentioned China. What do you think the role of China in Latin America will be over the next 3 decades?
Well, China, there's no doubt that China is has played a very significant role in recent years. Well, the first thing is that thanks to the dynamic evolution of China with rates of growth of 10%, so forth, the high demand for commodities, it has been one of the factors, as I said before, that has contributed to South America especially to have this boom. That's a positive side. Now the negative side is, of course, that if many of the Latin American countries, because of this boom situation, are going back to what was called in the early 50s, a primarization of the economy. So that's the bad thing. So what we should do in economic terms is to convince the Chinese that they not only have to be interested in the raw materials, in getting raw materials, but to move investment also in other areas, which will give value added. That's one thing. And the second thing, of course, is what are the political intentions in the relationship. I think China, for valid reasons for them, they feel they have an important presence in the world. They want to be good partners. So it's not to be against them, but to try to build up a way to work together between all parties. Since we are very unique in the sense that China is not a member of CAF, and the United States is not a member of CAF. So we want to work with China and with the United States. And if the triangle can get together in terms of solutions to some of the issues, well, of course, one of the issues is how you build democratic institutions in China. Well, the trend will come. But on the economic front are the issues of trade, the issues of investment, the issues of the environment. All those elements, if there is a consensus on certain factors, I think the world will be much better.
Well, as you look ahead for the Inter-American Dialogue, it needs to advance its rapport with Cuba. What else? What are the three or four things that the dialogue should be pursuing over the next several years?
Well, I think the things that should pursue, in my opinion, is to try to build up not the dialogue, to give input to the future administrations in the United States of an agenda of the relevant things that are relevant today, not things of the past. And there are new issues, very important issues. One issue, which is a very delicate one, is a controversial one, is the issue of drugs, for instance. That's a very important issue. In the Summit of the Americas that took place in Cartagena, President Santos, with a lot of courage, he put the topic for discussion. It's not that you're going to get solution because the views are different, but this is a central issue. It's an issue that has to do not only with the issue of those who produce the coca leaf or so forth. It's the issue of trade, it's the issue of security, it's the issue of who consumes that. So that requires a new strategy. It's difficult. And together with that is the issue of security, for instance. And all the themes of a partnership in a model to help, in the case of Latin America, to delve into a development agenda, long-term agenda for Latin America that precisely moves you from what is called comparative advantage based on commodities and low salaries to economies which will be move in a trend towards competitive advantage. A competitive advantage implies that you generate innovation, more technology, that you try to create value added, that you create productive employment. And this has to do with areas that are very crucial, aside from the macroeconomic side, which you have to keep the stability. But if you ask me four issues that are crucial, that one is infrastructure. Latin America has to double the level of infrastructure it has. It invests approximately 3% of GDP. It should invest at least 6%. Just to illustrate, China and the Asian countries, Korea, they invest 10%. Second.
Excuse me, and you mean roads, bridges, airports? Is that what you mean?
Energy, all that. Mm-hmm. Second thing, maybe the first one, is education. Education, but education, not only the primary education, not only the issue of gender, the issue of more advanced education at the secondary and tertiary level. Because I see in Latin America, in many countries, education is still education for the 19th of the 20th century. You need to have education for the 21st century. That's a different cause. Third thing, very important, is institutions. It's built institutions. When I say institutions, it's not only the executive branch of the governments, the democratic institutions, but also the legislative branch, everything that deals with justice. And also, when I talk about institutions, I'm talking about corporate governance, about the quality of the transparency, all those things. Those are issues, of course, are issues that Latin Americans have to solve. But the dialogue can help in influencing with policy. And in the United States, I think the main message I would say is that the U.S. has to recognize that Latin America today is not Latin America of 20 years ago. And that the power structure in the world makes that you have to have more flexibility, you have to have more understanding, you have to admit that not everybody thinks the same way, and you have to find ways to encounter points of agreement, although you don't agree on 100%.
Well, Enrique Garcia, I can see you're going to be the man of many years to come.
Well, I
Thank
hope.
you very much.
I'm getting old.
I don't think so. I don't think so. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's a pleasure for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Huh? Thank you.